Alright, y'all, so today I want to make a very quick video to give you my thoughts on Destiny 2014's original lost story. What could have been the original story for Destiny 2014, or Vanilla Destiny's original campaign. And it was really surprising. There was a lot of differences, a lot of characters were swapped out and factions. And of course, a lot of things were dramatically changed, of course, compared to the final game. And it's really fascinating to see what could have been this original story and what its potential impact on the franchise could have been. So in this video, like always, I'm going to give you a little bit of background / context on my history with Destiny, dig into this original version, compare the differences, why it was canceled, and of course, my overall opinions on everything. So regardless, let's get into it. So first, for a little background, I'm a pretty big fan of Halo. I know it's funny to talk about a Destiny topic and mention Halo, but, I'm a huge Halo fan. Halo is arguably my favorite game franchise, and at the core of that was Bungie. And, I got into Destiny like a lot of other kids at the time back in 2014 because I loved Halo. I was super excited for their next IP, and I was really interested to see, after they left Microsoft and they joined Activision at the time, what their new IP was going to be. It looked really immensely fascinating. The gunplay looked great. And I played the campaign. It was quite awful. And, there was a lot of people, including myself, that weren't happy with it. I kind of gave up on the franchise after that first game. I did eventually give it a second chance, and I'm glad I did. I think Destiny has improved a lot, even though there's still a lot of ups and downs. But turns out, to my surprise, and I didn't know this at the time when the game was coming out when I was a kid, that there was a behind-the-scenes mess that ultimately led to the game's campaign that we ultimately got in Vanilla Destiny. There was a lot of things that were changed. And, the whole story was originally scrapped back in 2013. And they only had a year to sort of cobble together a story that was being written by game developers, not writers. And it's a wild thing. So in this video, I'm going to get into it. Let's get into the original lost version of Destiny. Now, I'm getting most of my sources from people who have posted things anonymously online, and also that pretty good Kotaku article. So take everything I say with a little slight grain of salt, and like I said, a lot of information also on this original story is a bit hazy. We don't really have all the details. We don't have an in-depth knowledge. This is mainly come from anonymous postings, articles, and things that people have said over the years. So regardless, let's get into it. Now, there's two versions of this story, this campaign I want to get into. The reason why I'm saying there's two versions is because some people who have posted the other version have said that basically what that other version that guy posted was not true. That was not right. So there's, like I said, everything with a little bit of grain of salt, but I want to talk about, like I said, break down both different takes of this original campaign and structure. But a lot of these do, like I said, share a lot of similar beats and characters, but there's just some slight differences. But I'm going to cover both of them. So let's get into the original lost story of Destiny. So the first take of the original story actually came from a guy who posted about this way back in the day in 2014. He was apparently part of a group of people that was part of a user research case study that was done by Bungie in early 2013. So very early in the campaign and in Destiny's production life cycle. Like I said, originally Destiny was actually supposed to come out in late 2013. So it was definitely on track at this point. Now, this person basically got to see what the original kind of loose campaign was going to be. But basically, it would have started pretty similar to the final game, but then you would have been introduced to a character called the Crow. Now, this was a character that was eventually used and transformed into Queen Mara's brother. But he was an entirely different character originally. We even can see hints of this in the video showcase of the game in summer of 2013 that showed a little quick scene of the Crow and your character, the Guardian. The Crow, basically, to give a general rundown of his character, he was a hunter. He would have had a personality that was similar to Cayde 6, and also would have had a role similar to the Exo Stranger, but also would have been more involved with you throughout the campaign and missions. Now, the basic crux of this story is that you would have basically been discovering that there was something wrong with the Speaker and the Traveler. Now, The speakers were actually called originally Mask. They were not speakers, interesting enough. And, like I said, I guess throughout the early of the game, you would have noticed there's been something weird and dark about the Traveler, and there's would have been something really wrong about it. Then later on, you would have been abducted by a group that was led by this character called the Crow. Um, so basically, at some point, I guess, like I said, the structure of this is a little bit unclear, but you would have done a mission. You would may have met the Crow, and then at some point there would have been a second mission on Earth, and you would have basically been swooped down, knocked out, and basically been transported to a secret base on Mars by the group that's led by the Crow. You would have met other Guardians that would have abandoned the Traveler, the Speaker, and it would have been led by Crow and a burly old human, which actually was going to be called Osiris. Yes, Osiris was originally in Destiny 1's vanilla campaign. Crazy stuff. And there's even hints to Osiris in the final game that we got. So very interesting stuff, but he would have been looked way different. He also would have been made an assistant to this burly old man that's described, which would have been the Exo Stranger. I'm going to give you more information about all these characters and when I talk about the second version of the story that we got. But it's mentioned that this Exo Stranger would have been an assistant to Osiris, and it's potentially, in this variant of the story, he was male, but had the same personality as the Exo Stranger. You also met one or two other Guardians who have lost their ghost. And then you basically would have found out that the Traveler itself is evil. That the Traveler was actually the cause of the collapse of the Golden Age. Now, like I said, all this basic information was similar to how the vanilla game started. The Golden Age, we were told that the Traveler spurred its creation. It led to a huge progress and development for humanity. And that basically the darkness caused a collapse. And that was not true. We find out that actually the Traveler itself was the cause of the great collapse of the Golden Age. Basically, this group had found out through their travels that the darkness itself was actually a spawn of the Traveler rather than its rival. And that when the Traveler was brought to Earth, it unleashed its spawn, the darkness, and it basically took over the majority of technology that humanity had created up to this point, turned it against them, and nearly wiped out the human race. And like I said, at some point, I'm guessing we won the battle or the Traveler went dormant. And for centuries, it had remained in this state. And the truth of actually what happened became twisted. Of course, like in the game, the final game, the ghosts are sent out. These guys called the Mask or the Speakers are sent out and basically twisted the truth. They spreaded lies and myths about the Traveler, saying that the Traveler was actually protecting Earth in its darkest moments rather than actually trying to destroy it. So a pretty crazy revelation that big ball in the sky that we all thought was good in the vanilla game was not the case. It was actually an evil thing with malicious purposes, and that the Speakers, possibly the Ghost, are all evil to some extent. Crazy twist. It reminds me a lot of Halo 2, ironically. Now, at some point in this version of the game, you would have been sent to Venus to lure out a Gatekeeper, and you also would have been introduced to the enemy faction called the Vex. You would have stole the Gatekeeper's core, which supposedly held an AI that could help bring the truth to light about the Traveler and into the Speaker to the citizens of the last city. Then he kind of goes on to mention that at some point he recalls he goes to Mars to basically in another mission to retrieve the remains of another powerful AI that the Cabal was repurposing for their own uses. It's kind of speculated this actually might have been Rasputin, which, yes, Rasputin was in the original game, but he's not a giant AI system. He was actually going to be a Exo that was controlled, or at least has the AI called the Warmind in it. So very interesting. Rasputin was a physical character in this game. Now, at some point at the end of this mission, the test group was sent about 10 hours further in the game, where basically you would have been introduced to the moon, where players would have assaulted a hive base, introduced to that faction, and would have discovered from an AI that the Hellmouth, or the LLRC in this version of the game, was housing a super weapon that could revive the Traveler from its dormant state and wreak havoc on humanity again. And, you know, he doesn't really go too much into details beyond this. He mentions that the structure of the game would have been Earth, Venus, Mars, Moon, and does talk a little bit about a spider walker and stuff. But that was the basic gist of this original story, at least in this version that he talks about, that he saw in early 2013. The one that Joseph Staten, who at the time was the writer, the head writer of Destiny, alongside some other writers of Bungie, were crafting for the game. Very interesting stuff. Really quite different from the final game. You know, like I said, I honestly really like this version. I mean, even the Traveler being evil, really crazy stuff. Now I'm going to go into the second version of this campaign that was kind of described by another person who posted on anonymously online. The biggest difference with him is that this version follows a lot of the same events and goes into more detail what could have been originally Joseph Staten's lost version of the campaign, but there's a few differences. He mentions that the Traveler and the Speakers were not evil in this version, that they are still good. So I just want to point that out. And like I said, too, you know, it's never really been actually confirmed by anyone. At least Joseph Staten mentioned that this was confirmed. I know that Marty O'Donnell also spoke a little bit about Joseph Staten's original version. So, like I said, completely possible this is true. But, you know, like I said, let's get into it. So, this version of the campaign is pretty similar to the final version. Now, it was structured like this. Missions were going to be called chapters, and that overall arcs and story and characters would have been called books. Now, we did, of course, get books in the final game, but missions are not called chapters as far as I remember. So a little bit different, but mostly the same stuff. Now, the destinations also would have been the same. Venus, Mars, the Moon, the Cosmodrome on Earth. But the big thing is that actually the Dreadnought was supposed to be in this original campaign. Yes, sir. Originally, the Dreadnought was supposed to be a major part of it. It was actually described to be the big last third act of this campaign. Of course, we all know it got repurposed into the Taken King. Also, the social spaces would have been the tower and the lighthouse on Mercury with Osiris. So Osiris, of course, would have been a character in this. And the reef would have been a playable space that we actually got to explore. Something that we did get hints of and, of course, was later added in an expansion. Very interesting stuff. Now, characters in this original version, ghosts are still here, but they're probably much more of a comic relief type of role. The Crow is still here. He's a gunslinging hunter that fights alongside other missions. Still has the personality of Cayde 6. Osiris, I briefly mentioned him in my last version of the story, but he's basically an Obi-Wan-like mentor to you and basically would guide us as the player in the world of Destiny. He also would have had an assistant called an Hectite, or Hectic, I guess. Would have been basically the character that would eventually form into the Exo Stranger. Interesting. Also, the Queen eventually became the Queen Mara, so it's just called the Queen here. Apparently, she was going to be much more pirate-like and ruthless. And Rasputin, like I already mentioned, is an actual character. He's an Exo controlled by the AI Warmind. Very interesting stuff. Now, let's get into how this game originally was supposed to start. Now, you would have created your character, the Guardian. There would have been the same classes and the same cutscene that opened the final game with the Traveler and the astronauts and all that stuff. The player then would have started out in the Cosmodrome in Old Russia. You basically were sent by the last city to find someone named the Crow. You would have been fighting and introduced to the enemy faction called the Fallen. The player then would have fought a Fallen captain. Eventually, you would have encountered Crow for the first time, who at first is resistant to helping us, but eventually helps us on the mission. The chapter then would have ended at a cinematic at the tower where the player meets the Mask, aka the Speaker, who speaks about the Traveler and says our mission is important in preventing the last city from falling. Reason why is because the last city is protected by a big shield and it's starting to fail. So we basically end this chapter with the player getting a new ship and flying off. Very interesting stuff. This next chapter would have been, you would have landed on the Shattered Coast on Venus. Our goal is to reach the Archive, and we're actually introduced to the enemy faction called the Vex. We successfully get information from the archive, and we learn that the Seraphon is still alive. The chapter then ends with a cinematic of us arriving on Mercury, where we meet Osiris for the first time and let him know about what we've learned. Osiris is surprised by the info we found and says that if we can find the Seraphon Vault, we will become legend. So very interesting stuff. Chapter 3 would have next introduced the planet Mars. Our goal is to reach the Dust Palace and find something to help us on our search for the Seraphon Vault. We're introduced to the enemy faction called the Cabal. We tap into some technology in the Dust Palace and obtain a thing called a Seraphon Key. Crow, who's been with us this entire time, I'm assuming, gets in touch with the Queen, who in this version, Queen Mara and Prince Alderaan, of course, were brother and sister in the final game. The Crow, the character called the Crow, was apparently a former love interest to the Queen. So very interesting stuff. But we, of course, head to the Reef. It ends with a cinematic in the Reef where we meet the Queen in her throne room. There's tension between her and the Crow. The Seraphon Key is taken from us, from the Queen. The Queen is doing that. And we must make a deal with the Queen to retrieve it. The next chapter starts us out on the Earth Moon. Our goal is basically to infiltrate the Hell Mouth. Not much is known about this chapter. It ends with a Mercury cinematic with Osiris. So maybe, like I said, maybe even in this original version, the Hell Mouth was a weapon to revive the dormant traveler. Who knows? And we've been introduced maybe to the Hive. Chapter 5 would have then returned us to Venus, and we would land in the Ishtar Commons. Our goal is to figure out how the Fallen are luring out a Vex Keeper and kill it. We fight alongside the Crow in this mission and eventually reach the Endless Steps, where we fight an Ultra Vex Minotaur. Eventually, those big dudes that we fought at the end of the Vanilla Destiny campaign. We successfully defeat and find the Gatekeeper. The Crow says in this apparently in this mission, let's rip off its head and make a deal with the Queen. Ghost afterwards says, hopefully it's enough to buy back the Seraphon Key. This chapter ends with a cinematic back in the Queen's throne room in the Reef, where we successfully traded the Gatekeeper's head for our Seraphon Key. We learned that the Seraphon Vault is somewhere in the Cosmodrome underneath the Forgotten Shore. We next go back to Earth to the Cosmodrome. Our goal is to use the Seraphon Key to open the Seraphon Vault and find whatever is inside to save the city. We fight through Hive in this mission. We make it to the Seraphon Vault. We find out that there's an Exo inside that has been kidnapped by the Hive. A cinematic plays in the secret area underneath the Seraphon Vault. And the chapter apparently ends with a Reef cutscene. So, like I said, at this point, we would have basically, most likely would have found Rasputin. And, that basically would have found out as a character that he would have been kidnapped by the Hive and taken somewhere. And that's the mission where we basically would have found that out, most likely. The final chapter of Book 1, the player would have landed on the Hive Dreadnought and the Rings of Saturn. Our goal is to head through the ship into the Hive prison cell, keeping the Exo Rasputin. We fight through the Hive, discover a Cabal ship has impacted the side of the Dreadnought. Although we don't deal with them yet, we have to find the Exo. We make our way to the Hanging Crypts, where we rescue the Exo, who I guess in this mission we find out is named Rasputin. The chapter ends with a cutscene in the tower, but nothing is known about this one. Like I said, I'm assuming it's a big celebration. Yay, we rescued the important AI that could be instrumental in fighting the darkness. Now, this would have continued more in the campaign. There would have been another book. So basically, Joseph Staten's original story would have been 2 books in total. But Chapter 1 and Book 2 would have been, the player would have landed on Mars with the goal to enter the Berry City subway station, so a location we kind of saw in the final game. Chapter ends with a cinematic on Mercury, where we've spoken to Osiris about something Vex-related we found in that station. Chapter 2, there's apparently nothing known about this except the fact that it ends with a Reef cutscene and is on Venus. Chapter 3 would have been have the player returning to Mars. Our goal is to infiltrate a Cabal war base to get a key that's basically to open something Vex related. We fight through a lot of Cabal. We make it to the Legion's Keep, where we fight an Ultra Cabal Centurion that basically became the big dude that we fought from the Cabal in that mission in the final game. We successfully get the Vex key, and then the chapter ends with a cinematic on Mercury. No info what happens here. Interesting enough. So like I said, it's kind of the assumption that the big goal of this book would have been getting into the Black Garden to stop what the Vex have planning, and you would have gotten the Vex key from the Cabal. So kind of similar to what we got in the final game, but a bit different. Very interesting stuff, but still similar to the last half of that campaign. You still would have needed to get a Vex key and stuff. Chapter 4, there's basically no info except the fact that there would have been an Ultra boss in it at some point would have fought. And then Chapter 5 basically would have had players land on Mars. The goal is to use the Vex key to enter to the Black Garden and stop what the Vex is planning. We successfully enter the Black Garden through a doorway or a portal into the Mars subway station, where we find at the start of Book 2, we fight through the Vex, and there's a big climactic battle at the end. We come out the fight victorious. Apparently, the chapter ends with a cutscene in the Queen's couch, who at this point is in space above the planet, and she fires upon the Black Garden with her ship, causing the garden to collapse. And it's kind of unclear after this if there's going to be another cutscene at the tower. But that basically would have ended, according to the files and the early builds of the game, the original story of Destiny 1. Very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff. But, like I said, the structure of this campaign would have been quite different. It would have been split up into books and chapters. There would have been kind of 30 to 45-second scenes ending at the end and beginning of each chapter, so to speak, to give full context to what's going to happen in the campaign and set up events and characters. Very interesting stuff, right? Very interesting stuff. And Osiris seemed like a very much recurring character they would keep going back to on Mercury. Very interesting stuff. And there, like I said, mostly other different locations. But that was basically the general gist of the original story of possibly Joe Stain's original version of the campaign. Now, I'm going to kind of go into some other details about this original game that we could have gotten that were a bit different as well. Now, there would have been strikes and raids in this version of Destiny still. That was always being planned, even in the early stages of the game in 2013. But there just generally would have been different strikes than the ones we got in the vanilla Destiny campaign and story and the general gameplay. For example, and like I mentioned too, other characters would just be reworked. For example, the Crucible would have been pretty similar, and there just would have been some maps that were just never made it to the final game. In general, just would have been more PvP maps for Crucible in this early build of Destiny. Also, Lord Sax, interestingly enough, in the final game, looks way different than how he looked like in the original version of this game. In the original version, he looks more like just like a big burly human with a big beard. I'm kind of happy they redesigned him. He looks way better. Now, to talk about more references to some of the early strikes, there would have been apparently one on the Dreadnought called the Crux, where we basically find a hive boss named Osaro the Navigator. And there's plenty of other strikes as well. There would have been some strikes called the Den of Devils on Earth, the Nexus on Venus, the Dust Palace on Mars, Cerberus Vow 3 on Mars, the Summoning Pits Moon, and like I already mentioned, the Crux. Very interesting stuff. Now, there was also, I think you might have heard of this as well if you've heard of raids and stuff and what was originally planned. Now, obviously in the final game, we got the Vault of Glass raid, but originally that wasn't the case. We were going to be getting a so-called Hive Mega Raid. Now, what that means, who knows? But basically, it was a cut raid that was meant to take in place above the Hive Dreadnought, and it would have been a huge raid. It would have spanned, of course, multiple hours, and it was structured among multiple key areas in the ship and the Dreadnought. You would have fought alongside in areas called the Ballistic, the Gorgotho's Cellar, the Oversoul Throne, locations that apparently, like I said, kind of ended up in the King's Fall and Crota End raids in the final game. So very different. It would have been a Hive-themed mega raid. Something very different from the Vault of Glass, which was a much more Vex-themed raid. But very interesting stuff. And of course, there just kind of would have been different enemies and stuff and different names for stuff that were kind of warped around. And of course, like I mentioned, there would be different PvP maps. Now, I'm also going to get into the planned DLC and expansions, because even in this early version of Destiny, they were planning on doing expansions, and like I said, sticking to the Activision contract. releasing expansions and daily DLC. So like I mentioned, the Dreadnought was originally supposed to be in Destiny 1's campaign, so they originally weren't going to use that. Originally, Destiny 1's first major DLC was the codenamed Common. Now, this eventually, of course, became the Taken King, and it would have taken place in the EDZ on Earth. So yes, the EDZ, a place that we got to see in Destiny 2, was planned way back in the day for the first DLC of Destiny 1. Crazy how Bungie is just reusing stuff. But yes, that was the location. They were going to use the EDZ. It would have followed a book chapter structure similar to the final game or the original game in its campaign. Even there's been a leaked description of this. Apparently, it would have been described as, for its description of this DLC, amongst the remains of an old Earth village lies an artifact of our ancient past, a casualty of the Twilight Gap that will bring Guardians face to face with the darkness. So basically, the general gist is that apparently this basically would have been the EDZ. It would have been corrupted. It would have been complete with full force as well. And it would have been corrupted by a Traveler's Shard. And it would have featured a strike, a planned strike, at an abandoned airport in the EDZ. Very interesting stuff. Very interesting concepts. There was also other potential unfinished destinations that could have potentially appeared in expansions or even in Destiny 1's ever-evolving campaign and story. But places like Old Chicago, Cabal flagships, and even Europa were present in the files of this original game. Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. I mean, Old Chicago is something that they were talking about way back in the day, and I remember the developers are talking about it. I think still to this day, we have never had Old Chicago in Destiny. Crazy that they were already cooking it, and apparently it was all unfinished stuff, but crazy, crazy stuff. But, you know, like I said, it's kind of unclear with some of the other elements, but that was basically the general gist of most of the cut content in the original version of Destiny 1 that we could have gotten. Now, you know, like I said, there's some elements of this. Of course, we don't know all the facts. But like I said, it seems like most of these, the mission structures, the crow, the general vibe of the planets, all seems pretty similar across all versions of the story that's being told. Now let's get into ultimately why this original version of Destiny 1 was scrapped and canceled, and why we ultimately got the bizarre game that we got back in 2014. So, you know, like I said, in 2013, they were hard at work. Bungie was developing the game, and, you know, they were working on a version of the game in 2013 that was wildly different. Joseph Staten was head of the writing team. They was with the other writers. Apologize for the noise in the background, by the way. But Joseph Staten was the head of a writer's team. They were working on the writing, and basically at some point, he presented, of course, the first real look at Destiny. He also was at a conference that went into the whole aesthetics and mythos of the game. And, you know, showed that little video showcase in the summer of 2013 at a press conference for the game that showcased a very early version of the game. It showcased the early first part of the mission, the Cosmodrome. It featured a little bit of the dialogue and cutscene from the time that we would have been introduced to the Crow, which obviously was a major character in Joseph Staten's original story. And the hype was building, man. Hype was building, but internally things were starting to fall apart and collapse for this original version. Joseph Staten had apparently compiled a supercut, if you will, of this original story. It was described as apparently like a 2-hour rough cut, if you will, of the game. It featured some completed cutscenes, some incompleted stuff, some kind of, you know, placeholder narration. It was very much a very early draft of what the story was going to be for Destiny 1. And Marty O'Donnell knew about this. He apparently advised Joseph Staten not to show it and not to use it. But Joseph Staten still did it anyway and presented it to the main leadership and executives at Bungie. And this is really where it collapsed. People like Jason Jones and other executives at Bungie did not like it. They called it terrible. Now, there's been multiple sources that have kind of said different things. Some employees have said uh, different things about it. For example, some people called it terrible, describing it as just a confusing, highly erotic story that doesn't make sense. Some people called it campy. Other people said that it had strong characters. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it unraveled and solved a big entire mystery in the corner of the universe. And another person that apparently saw this so-called super cut of the game said that basically it didn't do it justice. That he said, while the quality of the super cut was bad, the plot itself wasn't inherently bad. But like I said, it didn't really matter. The Bungie senior leadership, the executives, didn't see it that way. They basically took a lot of issues with it. They thought it was too campy. They had a huge problem with the rhythm of progression because early on in this original story, in like the first like 4 chapters or 4 missions, you would have been introduced to all the main planets in the game: Earth, the Moon, Venus, Mars, and like I said, well, I guess the moon's not technically a planet, but who cares? Locations in the game, and they had a big problem with this. Jason Jones apparently said that he wanted a less linear story. I figured that was one of the key pillars of Destiny's design, and he also basically wanted the player to have the ability to jump between planets and space out the planets more sporadically about the story. So, by July of 2013, Bungie's leadership decided to totally reboot and scrap Joseph Staten's original Destiny story. They still kept much of the lore, the mythology, the Traveler, the idea of guardians, the enemy races and stuff, but it completely redid the original plot and narratives of the game. And basically just redid the game completely. The executives would form a group called the Iron Bar, so to speak, where Jason Jones would be working with other game designers and developers to completely rewrite the stories and also the general direction of the game, and basically cobble together a now requested less linear plot for this new version of the game. They also worked with a bunch of other designers and developers called the Blacksmith to basically kind of execute this idea and rescope the game. And they basically redid this by just sort of making everything way less linear and ultimately more confusing. They also decided to cut out major parts of its original story. For example, the Dreadnought was completely repurposed and cut out of the final game. It was later repurposed for the Taken King expansion later on down the line. They also kind of basically the general design aesthetic was that I think it was described by some other people. Like an objective was take you from A to Z, and the job of the developers was basically to take out H and J of that objective and repurpose it for a later mission or story. So basically, take pieces of the original campaign, repurpose it, form new missions, and repurpose things in between those missions that, like I said, don't make any sense outside of that mission and put it into other things. Just make everything less linear, make everything more scatterbrained and really confusing. Really wild stuff. Like I, of course, mentioned previously, tons of other characters and things were cut. Osiris was completely cut from this original version. The Crow was completely repurposed into Prince Alderaan. Osiris's assistant was rewritten into, of course, the Exo Stranger in the final game. And, like I said, they just made a really Franken story. I want to kind of give you a quote of this developer that actually spoke to a reporter about this in the Kotaku article that really just describes what they were trying, what they were trying to do to this game now. Basically mentioned, so if you were going from point A to point Z in the course, in the original cut reboot story, they would take the section H and J because it was a really tight encounter design, and they would put it off to the side and say, how do we get H and J into another storyline? It was literally like making a Franken story. So bizarre stuff. They would just take pieces of other already established missions. Doesn't make sense if you take them out of context and put them in other things and repurpose things. And it just, like I said, it was a bizarre thing. Now, all of this kind of unfolded, and a lot of head creatives of Bungie left. Joseph Staten left the company during the midsummer reboot of the game. Even though Bungie didn't apparently announce his departure till September. But apparently the party was not amicable. And Joseph Staten was probably mad that his original story got completely scrapped and rebooted. Of course, like I said, other writers that were kind of associated with Joseph Staten and his team were hired to sort of stay on and write dialogue and flavor text and stuff. Mainly also work on the lore that became what we call the Grimoire cards that were accessible at the time outside of the game and Bungie's website. But most of Staten's writing team did leave. And in general, the writers weren't really listened to in the game's development. Like I said, the leadership of the studio, the game developers, kind of just took the writing into their own hands and sort of stitched together a very loose narrative that was way less linear and honestly way more confusing. It was kind of, like I said, by some anonymous sources that basically the game story was being rewritten without writers. Wild stuff. And eventually, of course, as all this reboot, the reboot was happening. Originally, in early 2014, the game was supposed to ship. They eventually delayed it. I'm losing my words here. They asked Activision for an extension on the contract to delay the game till late 2014, which they eventually did. And eventually, of course, thanks to the developers, the group, the leadership called the Iron Bar and their changes, we got the final game that we got in 2014, unfortunately. And, that was really the mess and what really could have been the original story of Destiny 2014, Vanilla Destiny. So I want to kind of quickly talk about my thoughts on all this stuff and just kind of break it all down. And like I said, I probably forgot to mention some other things as well. Like, I already mentioned this. Osiris got cut later on Destiny 2. Rasputin got completely, rebooted, so to speak. And plenty of other elements got repurposed. But for now, my overall thoughts on all this craziness and what was really the original story and structure of Destiny 1. I think this would have been a way better game if this came out. I don't really see, I'm really curious to see Joseph Staten's original super cut, so to speak. Because even if it was the narrative that the Traveler was evil and that the Crow and all this stuff, and it was a narrative like that, or even if it didn't include that stuff and included, like I said, the books, the chapters, it overall would have been a story that had a beginning, it would have had a middle, and it would have had an end. It would have had a motivations, it would have had things that tied in with each other, it would have had context with this thing. It just would have been, a better story overall. I think the best way to describe it is it would have been a coherent story that would have had characters that we can follow. I mean, it sounds like characters like the Crow we would have been able to latch ourselves onto. We would have been getting to see characters that we could see the world through. Like I said, the Crow sounded like one of those characters. Osiris being this Obi-Wan Kenobi-like mentor role makes a lot of sense. Like I said, you need a character like that, not a vague character like we got in the final game that, actually helps explain things and, actually helps guide us through this big new universe and world. And the Ghost, like I said, also probably would have portrayed a similar role. And, like I said, I think this game, like I said, even though I don't really care, like some of the complaints are just weird. Like, it would have been campy. I mean, is that necessarily a bad thing? It was also described as being a little too Star Wars-y. I mean, to me, that's necessarily a bad thing. Star Wars is a great franchise. And, Star Wars has a story, at least. Like I said, what we got in that first game was so incoherent and so messy and so beyond bad. I honestly think it's a real damn shame we never got to see Joseph Staten's original version of the story get realized. I'm hoping one day the supercut becomes, I guess, leaked and available online to kind of see what could have been. Obviously, Destiny did recover after its rocky launch. It became, of course, a 10-year franchise. And you can arguably make arguments either way to say that, you know, Destiny 1's launch, at the time, while it was definitely flawed and had a lot of issues, still ultimately led to a successful franchise. And yeah, that's absolutely true, but I still think from that first game, it could have been way better. And you could have had even a bigger start and bigger franchise if that original story was probably put in place. And I do like the narrative. For what it sounds like, I do like the Crow. I do like Osiris's role in it. I also like how the structure is. I actually don't mind the idea of being introduced to the planets quickly, and it being introduced to the factions. And I don't know. I just think that this story has a lot more structure to it, and it feels more coherent. But yeah, that was the canceled and lost version of Destiny 1's story that was originally going to be done by Joseph Staten. It was a really damn shame we never got to see this. But, it is what it is, and the rest is history. But yeah, my quick thoughts on this situation. Thank you if y'all decide to stay to the end of the video for listening to this. Thank you for staying along. If you have any thoughts or comments or anything you want to add, definitely let me know. But yeah, that was my thoughts on the original canceled Joseph Staten version of Destiny 2014. Hopefully y'all have a good day, and peace, y'all.